Hello and welcome to Economics Unscripted, the podcast where sustainability meets business, economics, environment, and everything in between. I'm your host, Ritwij Raj from the Adam Smith Business School's Responsible and Sustainable Management Steering Group, the proud producer of the series. In today's episode, we are diving into one of the most urgent and complex challenges of our times: climate financing in the global south. As the impact of climate change intensify, developing economies face the dual challenge of pursuing growth while transitioning to a low carbon future. Yet, financing this transition from mitigation to adaptation remains one of the biggest bottlenecks. To help us unpack this critical issue, I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, a retired Indian Administrative Service officer from the 1983 batch who served as Economic Affairs Secretary of India, Finance Secretary of India, and Power Secretary of India. He has also represented India as an executive director at the World Bank, where he played a key role in shaping financial and developmental policies. Mr. Garg, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real privilege to have you on the Economics Unscripted.
Thank you, Ritwij. I'm also very pleased to join Adam Smith Business School, and to do this podcast with you, discussing one of the most important issue which the developing countries and the whole planet faces. Very happy.
Sir, to begin with, could you please help us understand what climate finance really entails in the context of the global south, and how does it differ from traditional developmental finance, and why it has become such a pivotal issue in recent years?
Very true. See, there has been over last couple of decades a kind of acceptance by everyone that the business cannot go on as usual, which was the case for 250 years of industrialization, where you sort of extract the fossil fuels, both coal and the hydrocarbons principally, burn them and sort of achieve industrial production and economic progress, but burdening the climate with the carbon dioxides and the other greenhouse gases, as well as the other polluting materials. Now, the so-called global north, essentially the industrialized countries, also called as developed countries, high income countries, most of them, they have achieved this progress at this cost. The developing countries, or the global south, so to say, hasn't been as successful in industrialization. It does want to industrialize, because that is the path for progress and higher GDP. Now, to do that industrialization, and also to now pivot to the new digital age, if you use the same fossil fuels, uh, possibly it is costlier, and possibly it may not achieve you the objective of faster industrialization and creating a digital economy. Therefore, there is a widespread recognition now that you need to sort of pivot to the new energy, which is essentially the solar energy, the wind energy, and the wider basket of what we call renewable energy, including hydrogen, nuclear, and all. So, if you were to use this new energy, which has been for last many years relatively costly than the traditional energy, then you need it to finance this extra cost for doing the same industrialization, or same achieving the same function of using the energy. Now, where do you, so if you use the new fuels, new energy, and it costs you more, developing countries which are not having adequate to even finance the traditional industrialization using the fossil fuels, they can't have this additional finance available for transitioning or using the new energy. That is why somebody need to finance, and the whole dialogue today that the developed countries, the industrialized countries, should be actually helping in financing this additional cost of climate change on account of climate change to bring about the climate change and make the progress in a sustainable, responsible, and environmental friendly way is the basis, to my mind, of the entire dialogue about the climate finance.
Yeah. So another aspect which I want to talk about is that we often hear about the $100 billion annual commitment made by developed nations under the Paris Agreement. Yet the global South continues to struggle with access to meaningful climate finance. And day before yesterday, I was in London and I was attending a book launch by Sana Marine, and I asked this question to her as well. That despite us talking so much about global south and climate financing and climate change, we still struggle. We look at the air quality index in New Delhi, look at the air pollution that surrounds the global south and even the global north. So in your experience, what structural or institutional barriers are preventing the flow of funds to where they are needed the most?
See, this is a very dynamic situation. So in 2008-9, when President Obama first time committed that the developed countries would provide $100 billion per annum in climate financing, to now in 2025-26, about 16, 17 years later, in this period, there's been a lot of change. One, the change is that the cost of using the renewable energy has also come down significantly. It is not the situation in 2006, 7 or 7, 8 to now. In many places, the renewables have actually become quite competitive. So that is one big change which is impacting the dialogue about it. The second change is that the industrialized countries have seen the rise of many developing countries as well, most spectacularly China and the East Asian countries, who have now progressed significantly and have either reached the high income status or are very close to it. And they are also very well industrialized, so much so that today China produces roughly about 30% of the global goods. It is industrialized goods. It has become the factory of the world. Um, there is also another major change. Some of the developed countries, especially the United States, has seen leadership changes which don't believe actually that there is anything like climate change or it is being caused by the use of coal or the hydrocarbons. Their energy needs have also gone up, largely because of the need for data centers and artificial intelligence and many other things. So all these factors have combined to make the ground or underlying situation change substantially. My sense is that today the industrialized countries, especially the United States, doesn't believe that its obligation to provide any sort of finance to the developing countries, and with China and others becoming the big polluters of the world, so to say, it is it is difficult for them to take moral or any other high ground to say that they need to be supported with finance. So with all these changes taking place, it is I think sort of changing the ground situation where there is virtually no real commitment. You, in fact, are changing in the other spheres as well. Look at the tariffs, for example. For last 3 to 4 decades, the tariffs have been used to provide finance or to the people, to the developing countries in the global south, so to say, by keeping their products subject to very low or zero duty. Now you're changing the game completely, where what is coming to the United States is subject to much higher tariffs than what United States is exporting to others. So in climate spheres or tariff spheres, or even the grant sphere, the development assistance in the form of grant is dead. So I think all these changes are making it look very difficult that in this new architecture, in this new structure of the world, there is any real hope for the finance to flow from the industrialized developed countries to developing countries for climate finance purposes.
Yeah, so you talked about governance and accountability, and since you have served at some of the most prestigious positions in the financial world, be it serving as the executive director of the World Bank or as the finance secretary of India, a frequent criticism is that when the climate funds reach developing countries, they are not always used efficiently or transparently. So, how can governments in the global south, if such is the case, ensure accountability, good governance, and measurable outcomes in the way climate funds are deployed?
So here, I think we will need to sort of divide the climate-related funding which reaches the developing countries. On the one hand, one side is the private finance. It comes from the private companies and private institutions to the mostly to the private industries and businesses in the developing countries. There is no such issue of about holding accountable, because this is a business relationship. If somebody is financing or funding investment in India's, let us say, renewable or solar manufacturing industry, or is financing an institution which sort of invests in development of the technologies or the algorithms to make better kind of climate related products, that is between the two parties, and there is a commercial relationship between them, and I don't think there is any governance or institutional issues about it. What essentially it concerns is the financing flows from two major sources. One is the bilateral finance from the countries themselves, let us say US or European countries or Japan for that matter, providing some grants or some aid or concessional finance to the developing countries for their projects or investments, so to say. And the second one is the finance which comes from multilateral or other official agencies to finance the projects of the developing countries, whether it's the World Bank or the AIADB or AIB or NDB. So there are many multilateral institutions. I think the issue of accountability, better use is more connected with this. As I said a little while earlier, the bilateral finance is increasingly disappearing. Though for last 2 decades before Trump came, the earlier bilateral finance, which is going for traditional industries and investments, was sort of changing color for refugee conflict finance as well as the climate finance. But now I think there is a very sharp reduction in this kind of finance flowing from there, from the industrialized developed countries to developing countries. And as the finance reduces or evaporates, so to say, there is very little issue of the accountability. It is now the multilateral institutions as well as the special institutions being set up. For example, let us take this loss and damage fund, which COP29 set up, or the World Bank and other finance. There, I think accountability standards and the protocols are all set in the specific projects and the approvals which are granted. I don't think anybody can accuse any other country by saying that you are not responsible, because that responsibility can always be and is always assessed by the teams which assess the progress of those projects and also watch the disbursements of those funds for those projects. Unless there is a good progress, unless there is a real execution, the funds disbursements don't take place. And therefore, I think rather than talking about in a very vague or loose or uncertain manner about the governance or the institutional or accountability issues in the developing country, it will be better to sort of focus in case there is any particular, for any particular project, there is some miscarriage or there is some misuse of the funds or not a very proper use of the funds. So let it be project specific rather than as a general sort of assessment. I don't think there's a general assessment or general comment that developing countries are not responsible or have not been holding themselves accountable for proper use would be a fair
Yeah.
characterization.
So now coming to India's leadership role in this area. So given India's growing influence in global climate negotiations and its strong renewable energy ambitions, what lessons can other developing nations learn from India's climate finance and energy transition strategy? Do you think India can serve as a model for balancing growth and stability? And from your time as the Finance and Economics of Affairs Secretary of India, can you recall some personal projects where you were working on these areas, and how and what lessons can other bureaucrats learn from your experience over here?
See, India has been on the receiving end of this sort of climate crisis and has therefore been taking this position, in India's view, a principled position, that there is a case of differentiated joint and differentiated liabilities. Historically, the industrialized countries of today have sort of put in most of the carbon in the atmosphere. Most of the emissions came from them, and therefore they should be sort of also bearing the cleaning up cost. This position, as I said earlier, is no longer being accepted by those who are being accused of being the polluters of the climate. So I think India is having a sense of realism. If you go through the proceedings of the last COP in Baku, India ended up being in a very sort of distressed kind of situation. It didn't really lead to where India wanted it to go. This year's expectations from COP30 is much, much lower. The kind of role India's delegation is playing is not that frontline kind of role. It's more of a kind of realizing that things may not turn out to be, and that is reflected in the progress you saw of, let us say, one major institution which COP wanted to create, this loss and damage funds. There is hardly any sort of commitments for that. There are very little funds. It now says that for 25, 26, 2 years, it will disperse 250 million. Now that's pittance. It's neither here nor there. America has already withdrawn, except Germany, UAE. Nobody seems to be a major enthusiastic and contributor. So I think India now is realizing, if I may so, I can't speak officially for the government of India now, uh, that there is a certain kind of futility which is setting in all these kind of negotiations, and how one should revisit one's own strategies and one's own thinking about the future is to be seen. You asked me about my experiences. I think, as I said, things are changing very fast. Um, we at that time thought that by adopting very good goals uh, for energy transition to solar power, 500 gigawatt by 2030, and in bringing a very fast transition to EVs, would perhaps take India to a good path and leadership role into this. Unfortunately, that has not been as fast progress as we had expected. Some other countries like China, etc., have done much better on in all these fronts there. Um, so developing countries, other countries in the global south, I think they need to realize that not much is going to come out of these climate or COP talks or these institutions. They'll have to figure out how would they finance their growth, and how would they bring about that growth. In my judgment, it is different technologies and different policies at different times. For last 250 years, it is the industrialization which is driving the growth. But today, industrialization has also reached its limits. Today, it's mostly the digitalization, the computerization, the information technology, energy transition. These are going to drive future growth, and therefore, instead of looking forward or arguing for or negotiating for getting any finance support from the governments of the developed countries, it's better to get on to the commercial aspects of it, and to see that these technologies become increasingly more and more competitive. So the other developing countries can contribute or can collaborate with India and others too. And we have done very well at that. We have now our new solar capacities in India are coming at cost, which is including storage, which are very competitive with coal. And therefore, if you can produce power at cost cheaper than coal, or you can produce electric vehicles at about the same or cheaper cost than the traditional ICE, why not switch to that? And with or without any sort of support which comes from that, finance your own growth. I think in human history, it's very rare that somebody accepts the responsibility, or even if that country is very rich or so, accept the responsibilities and provide finance and assistance to other countries. Everyone has to find its own way. So developing countries, including India and others, might actually, if they want, can collaborate and find their ways. One of the way perhaps is, and it looks ironic in the Indian context, because China seems to have done very well on all these future technologies. How can the developing countries now, sort of on commercial basis, work with China to make sure that their path is also sort of progressed, and they achieve far better growth and redistribution in times to come and make their own future?
Yeah. So, talking about the future, finally looking ahead, what reforms or innovations would you like to see in the global financial architecture to make climate finance more accessible, equitable, sustainable, and impactful for developing economies? To conclude our discussion.
So very clearly, I think one major area of reforms is that the current global institutions like World Bank and ADBs, and which are essentially the donor controlled and financed institutions, are not going to be the principal vehicles for your financing. It's better to sort of switch to the borrower finance or the developing countries owned and financed institutions like AIIB and the NDBs, and some more can be set up. India can set up some and raise finance for meeting the developing countries' needs. That is one clear way. Second, increasingly, the private industry in all these developing countries need to be put into the front, because it is there where the innovation takes place. And these private industries, by collaborating amongst themselves and also sort of working on a business relationship with the current industrialized and developed countries, can then sort of invest in those machines and those industries which produce what I said, the future goods, so to say, and then take it forward rather than wasting time in these kind of climate talks where nothing actually results. I think that's what my sense. It's a major change. You can only take care of you rather than looking for and depending on others that you take care of us. It's better to sort of move ahead and create a world, including financial institutions, which take care of you yourself.
Yeah, Mr. Garg, thank you so much for sharing such valuable insights. Climate finance truly sits at the intersection of economics, governance, and global equity, and your experience offers a much needed perspective on how the global south can shape its own sustainable future. That's all for today's episode of Economics Unscripted. I'm Ritwij Raj, and I hope this conversation helped you better understand how finance can be a force for climate action. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore how sustainability, policy, and business intersect to shape a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritwij. It was pleasure talking to you. All the best to you. Thank you.